welcome. Thank you for being here. In this video, we're going to talk about how to take a hybrid training approach to triathlon. And specifically what I mean by that is if you want to pursue triathlon, whether just the events of triathlon or pursue a specific distance and event itself, but you also want to prioritize lifting and strength training with about equal as much of an emphasis as the triathlon itself. My goal with this video is to make it very broadly applicable to whether you just want to, like I said, pursue the events of triathlon or whether you want to pursue a sprint or an Ironman. Obviously, those are two very different events and require very different training approaches. But a lot of the sort of big picture, broad concept ideas do tend to be the same. And so I'll speak to when one thing might be different for something like a sprint triathlon distance or an Ironman distance triathlon. And again, there are always sort of personal nuance details that are relevant whenever you're designing any type of training program. My goal with this video is to hopefully put you on the right track and getting better results and hopefully enjoying your training more so going forward. So as always, here's the plan for the video. I will preface this by saying this is likely going to be a bit of a longer video as far as my videos go, just because there is a good bit to cover here in order for this to be comprehensive and as helpful as I want it to be. So we'll start off with what you need to train each week. So in other words, what are the specific kinds of trainings that are going to be components of the program? We'll talk about how many days per week do you need to train, because obviously that's going to be different depending on whether you're doing a sprint distance triathlon or an Ironman distance triathlon. And just really quickly, if you're not familiar, a sprint distance triathlon is a 400-meter swim. It's usually a 10-ish mile bike. Sometimes depending on the event itself, it can be 11-ish. It can vary a bit. And then it is a 5K run, whereas an Ironman triathlon is a 2.4 mile swim, a 112 mile bike, and then a marathon, a 26.2 mile run. Obviously, vastly different types of event. And I have been known in my other content to say that you can do hybrid training. In other words, the pursuit of, let's say, strength and endurance simultaneously. Obviously, hybrid can be a bit more broad, but you can train that way with as little as 2 days per week of structured exercise with a thought out enough program. But when it comes to triathlon and your endurance pursuits are already multiple in nature. I mean, there's 3 events that make up triathlon. So I think there is a bit more to say in that regard. We'll talk about what your programming should look like with regard to every component of the programming. So the strength training and the triathlon specifics are going to take up the bulk of that conversation. Plyometric and anaerobic conditioning, I'll talk about what those mean in a bit. Those are sort of more minor details that can make a big difference, in my opinion, when they're programmed appropriately. And with regard to triathlon specifics, in this video, we're not going to talk too much about how to program triathlon more generally. I mean, there are entire books written about that. It's kind of a bit more broad of a concept than I want to cover in this video. But we'll talk about the programming considerations that you should think about when you want to take a hybrid specific approach to the event. And then lastly, we'll talk about tapering, and I'll talk about some general what a taper is and what some general best practices are, because that's not going to take too long. And then we'll talk about what, in my opinion, tapering should look like when you're taking a hybrid approach. Because again, my goal with this video is to make it as hybrid specific as possible, meaning if you want to lift with place as much focus on your lifting as you are on triathlon, like a roughly 50-50 equal focus, that's kind of what I want the direction of this video to be. So kind of already covered this in the plan, with what's actually in the table of contents. Obviously with triathlon, swimming, biking, and running are going to have to be trained at some point throughout the week. Strength training, that's kind of an obvious one again, because this is a hybrid approach. And again, we're going to speak more about the details of that later on. Anaerobic conditioning. So anaerobic conditioning differs from aerobic conditioning, really just in terms of intensity, and by way of intensity in terms of duration. So you have 3 main energy systems within your body. I have another article and video covering this concept in a bit more detail, so I'm not going to go too far into it. But 2 of those energy systems are anaerobic in nature, meaning they do not require oxygen in order to produce energy. However, these anaerobic energy systems can usually only last when they are being, pushed to their max, about 4 minutes in total duration, for most people, at least. And again, that will be covered in more detail once we get to that section. And then plyometric training, which again, we're going to talk about a bit more once we get to that section. So now that can obviously seem like a lot to juggle within 1 week. And a lot of this video is going to talk about how to sort of appropriately combine different kinds of trainings so you don't have to have multiple different trainings throughout the day or throughout the week in order to get everything done. So one of the first things you should think about is what's commonly called a brick. And a brick, really, it's not necessarily a triathlon specific term, but you hear it used much more in the triathlon world. And that's when you go really from one training modality immediately into another. So an example of that would be doing, let's say, a 30-minute bike session on a bike, followed immediately by a 30-minute run. And you can hopefully see why that would be somewhat specific to what a triathlon is. So like I said before, anaerobic conditioning and plyometric training, the amount that you're going to want to do in order to really get the benefit that you would be after for those types of training is pretty small. And similarly, the stress imposed on your body by those types of trainings is in a lot of ways similar to what the stress imposed on your body is from lifting. Moreover, because of that time commitment, it makes it somewhat practical to combine those with your strength training sessions. So when we talk about session structure and weekly structure, we'll put that into a bit more practice. But just for right now, you can assume that anaerobic conditioning, strength training, and plyometrics can be grouped into the same session, usually just one, maybe 2 times per week, depending on where you are in a program. Again, anaerobic conditioning is any type of training in which you hit fatigue within 4 minutes, meaning this is very high intensity types of effort. Plyometric training, I'll touch on this a bit now because I think it'll make everything else down the road a bit more practical. So when you look at the research looking at the combination of strength and endurance training, what you tend to find is that the presence of endurance in a program does not inherently limit the gains you'll make in strength and muscle size, and vice versa, meaning that the presence of strength training in an endurance training program is not going to inherently limit the gains you make in endurance, really no matter how much you do, as long as it's programmed right and it's appropriate for you. Goes without saying. However, when you look at these reviews, there's, at least in the most recent one, the one that I'm basing this claim off of, and again, everything will be cited down below, one of the studies in the review did look at vertical jump height in the context of concurrent training, meaning people who did strength training only or strength training plus endurance training. And then they looked at the maximal height that they can perform on a vertical jump. What they found was that the strength training only group had a greater improvement in vertical jump height. Granted, both groups had improvements in vertical jump height than the concurrent group. Now, also in that study, they weren't actually training vertical jump. So it's kind of hard to say, like, if you're not training it, then, should you expect to get better at it? But for me, it's enough rationale to say that some type of high velocity, high speed, power type of training is beneficial to have and probably important to have in a program. Plyometric training is the power training of choice that I would recommend for this sort of pursuit, because a plyometric training is essentially any kind of high velocity movement in which you are also bouncing off the ground, let's say. So a repeated vertical jump, if you did 5 vertical jumps as high as you could, that would constitute plyometric training, where if you had, let's say you had a barbell on your back and you're doing a barbell back squat, but you're doing your reps with lightweight as fast as you possibly can, that would also be power training, but it's not plyometric because you're never actually leaving the ground and bouncing off the ground and having that rebound effect. The reason I prefer typically plyometric training as the mode of power training for hybrid triathlon, and really most forms of hybrid training, is because there is some degree of adaptation you can get from that rebound effect itself that can transfer over into running, for instance. And that's really what I mean down here. So as you get better at plyometric training, the idea of, bouncing off the ground, your legs essentially become springier. And with each step you take while you're running, you expend less energy. So if you're going to expend 500 calories on a run, those 500 calories will take you farther if you are a bit more springier through your legs. And now, like I said, you can do hybrid training with as little as 2 days per week if it's structured out well. However, with triathlon, in my opinion, I think 5 days is the minimum amount of training days per week that you should aim for if you want this to be your goal. You technically could do it with 4 days per week. I mean, I can think of ways you would do it, that it can be done. But honestly, I think if you chose something other than triathlon, like let's say running specifically, if you only have 4 days per week to dedicate toward, structured exercise, I think you'll see more results faster with that more specific targeted approach than if you chose triathlon. Now, it goes without saying that if you are looking at more of like a sprint distance triathlon sort of thing, 5 days is going to be enough. But if you're looking at more of an Ironman type of approach, 7 is going to be honestly the minimum, probably some double days. I mean, you're signing up for an Ironman in that case, so you kind of know what you're signing up for. The next factor to take into account is whether you want to complete the race or compete in the race. And there is no wrong answer, but it affects how, let's say, flexible or rigid you can be with your programming, and also just the overall mindset you're going to have throughout the entire training period. Now, if your goal is to complete the race, what I mean by that is just cross the finish line and do it safely, then whatever number of training days you want to do, 5, 6, or 7, that's going to work out just fine. If you want to compete, like you want to put out your best possible time within the amount of training time you are going to dedicate towards this pursuit, I can think of ways that it can be done with 5 training days per week, but really 6 or 7 might be more appropriate. And that's true even for like a sprint distance triathlon. But again, there is no right or wrong answer. You may or may not enjoy the process of one more than the other. And I think whether or not you actually enjoy the process of doing this is more important than, having one that just seems morally better or whatever the case may be. Now, with regard to if you're signing up for an event, let's say, because this is obviously different if you're just wanting to train the events of triathlon. But if you're going to sign up for an event, it does depend on, what your starting point is, like how fit you are currently in terms of both strength and endurance, and then endurance on each individual sport within triathlon. But if we're going to start out looking at a sprint triathlon, and let's say you're somewhat new to triathlon, like this is a novel pursuit for you. In my opinion, 12 weeks of training plus 2 weeks of that can be for a sprint, that can be 1 week of tapering, but somewhere between 13 to 14 weeks is, in my opinion, going to be the minimum that you should really think about if you want to do this right. And again, as you increase the distance of the event that you're pursuing, like if you're going to do an Olympic distance triathlon or a half Ironman or Ironman, the longer the runway you're going to need. However, granted, I should also say that for any event, the longer the runway you have in terms of preparation, the better it's going to go. And the more flexibility you have with your programming, missing a session here and there and things like that. Also, the lower your cardiovascular fitness is, then also the longer the runway you should probably have. And what I mean by that is the more preparatory weeks that you should have before you actually do the event. Now, before we get into the specific programming features for each individual mode of training, there are two broad programming concepts that are going to make everything else work a bit better. The first is that you, if possible, should avoid training muscle intensely 2 days in a row. So when I'm referring to training muscle intensely, what I'm really saying is strength training, because that's, you're taking your sets and your failure, ideally. Anaerobic conditioning, because as we talked about, that is pretty high intensity, really should be some of the hardest type of training you do across the week. And then plyometric training. And this is part of the rationale for why I say it can be practical and beneficial to combine all these into the same session, 1 to 2 days a week. But for instance, if you do, let's say, a full body lift today, let's even say a leg day today, like a leg strength training type of day, you can do an easy run or an easy bike tomorrow. And it's really, you might be sore, you might be a little fatigued, but it's fine. You're not going to induce any sort of real risk of injury. And you're going to see meaningful adaptations from that training. But I wouldn't recommend that if you did a lower body lift today, that you do a high intensity run tomorrow. Part of the reason is you could argue that the risk of injury is a bit higher by stacking intensity on each other like that. But then again, if your leg, when you're doing your high intensity training, it's important you actually make it high intensity. And if your legs are fatigued from your strength training and you're not actually able to get into those higher intensity zones, then you're just not going to get the benefit that you would seek to get from it. This second principle is one that I personally like to program more in line with. When I write programs for clients, I typically enjoy this type of structure a bit more. But it's really, if let's say you're going to do a 12-week program in preparation for a sprint triathlon. And let's say you're going to divide that 12-week program into 3 4-week training blocks. That first training block might be like a 60% focus on strength training and a 40% focus on endurance training. The second training block, the middle one, might be more of a 50-50 split. And then the third one might be more of a 60% focus on endurance and a 40% focus on strength trainings. You're sort of gradually shifting from a strength training focus, light bias, I should say, to an endurance bias as you approach the event itself. I think this really, in a lot of ways, serves to make the training a bit more enjoyable, as your training will look a bit more variable as you go through the process. But also it can be a bit more specific and allow you to peak a bit more effectively. When you're starting off with that sort of 60% strength training type of focus, you might also have a bit more anaerobic conditioning as part of that programming in that first 4-week training block, using that same example we talked about before. So you can really, sort of capitalize and maximize the benefits you get from that type of training, and then really push the endurance volume so really in that peak shape by the time you go into that taper and by the time you go into the event itself. So here's a quick example of if you're using full body training, which is what I like to use for most of the clients that I write hybrid triathlon program. There are other splits that we'll talk about, but I think full body training, at least as far as your lifting goes, I'm speaking to right now, is the most practical that you have available to you. So on a 6-day routine, you could do on Monday, this is like a full body true strength and conditioning type of day where you start off with some plyometric training. You do some full body strength, not as much as Wednesday, and then you finish off with some anaerobic conditioning. Again, as we get into these specific modes of training, we'll talk a bit more about what that's going to look like specifically. This is just sort of the bird's eye view right here. Tuesday could be a 30-minute easy cycle and a 30-minute easy treadmill run, or it could be outdoor bike, outdoor run, whatever is more practical for you. I'm just talking about a brick here so that you get both modes of training in. Wednesday and Friday would be just true full body strength, muscle growth, focus type sessions. No plyometric or anaerobic conditioning in those. Thursday would be 30-minute easy cycle again, I would say here, followed by an 30-minute easy swim. And then Saturday would be an outdoor run, not max effort, but more of a tempo threshold-ish kind of run. Now, again, this is an example of training split that I wrote for nobody. This has no personalization to it. So, what you select as your anaerobic conditioning would matter for you in terms of what you are, let's say, maybe weakest at and where the most or the highest opportunity is going to lie. You might want to psych out one of these cycles for another run. You might want to add a bit more swimming depending on where in triathlon you need a bit more work. But here's just an example of what the distribution of training might look like, and you can sort of modify this to your own preferences as needed. If you want to only have structured training 5 days per week, you could do, let's say when you're farther out from the event and you are just beginning the preparatory period, you could have 3 full body strength sessions per week plus 2 true endurance sessions per week. And then as you get closer, you could just sort of flip that to 2 endurance, or 3 endurance rather, and 2 strength. And then if you have the desire and availability to train 7 days per week, you could, let's say 3 phases. We could say 12 weeks with 4-week blocks, as we talked about before, where the first 4 weeks would be an upper body, lower body split as far as the strength training goes, along with endurance training sessions on your other 3 days of the week. And again, what those look like would be dependent on what you are most in need of right now. And the anaerobic conditioning could be tossed in on a lower body day here, or same thing with the plyometric. As you get closer, so the middle of this training block here, you could switch to full body strength training sessions with a greater number of endurance. So this would be more like a 50-50 focus kind of split right here. And then in the third phase, the final training phase of the program, you could go down to, let's say, 2 full body strength days per week. Again, with a proper structuring that is still enough volume as far as strength goes to see results over time. And then you just increase the volume of endurance you're doing in order to sort of peak for the event. Something I think is worth opining on real fast is that a lot of people make the mistake when you are strength training either in combination with an endurance pursuit like running, or for the purpose of enhancing your running progress, is making your strength training look too much like running. Really, it shouldn't look at all that different from regular strength training in general. The only key consideration you should be taking into account when you are doing a hybrid approach to something like a triathlon is just load management. So, modulating the load and intensity and volume of your lifting within the context of that there is a notable amount of endurance training occurring throughout the week. But again, single leg training or isolated hip abductor training is not going to provide you with any more benefit than just a barbell back squat for at least, let's say, your running or your cycling performance. Now, as far as training splits goes, the examples I gave you previously used upper body and lower body splits, as well as full body splits. And now when you look at the total weekly volume you do, and we can define that as the number of sets per muscle group taken somewhat close to failure per week. It doesn't matter too much how you split that up across the week, assuming it all gets done. So let's say you're going to do 10 sets of chest across a given week. It doesn't really seem to matter too much if you do all 10 sets on the same day, if you do 5 sets on 2 different days, or if you do 3 sets on 2 days and 4 sets on another. If the total weekly volume is the same, you're not going to really see too much difference in the results you see over time. So with that said, I still pretty much unanimously recommend full body training and upper body, lower body training, not even just for hybrid triathlon, but really to everyone. With that said, I recommend it that much more vehemently for a hybrid triathlon approach. One of the reasons why is that if you're following a bro split, let's say, where you have a chest day, a back day, a shoulder day, a leg day, things like that, you're training each muscle group 1 day per week for the most part. If you miss one of those days, then you miss out all of your weekly volume for the muscle group in that week. Whereas with a upper body, lower body, or a full body split, you can miss a training session here and there, and it's really just not that big of a deal. You still have enough volume elsewhere in the week to make up for it, and you'll still see gains if life gets in the way every now and then, which it will. It does for everybody. The second reason I prefer an upper body, lower body, or a full body split is that there is something to be said about your fatigue being more dispersed evenly throughout the week. So if you're doing, again, let's use the bro split, that's sort of the polar opposite, so it's the easiest to sort of compare and contrast to. If you're doing, a chest day, shoulder day, back day, leg day, then whatever muscle group you train, it's just going to feel crushed the next day, as opposed to feeling, somewhat stimulated evenly throughout the week. So if you have, let's say, a back day on one day, and you want to swim the day after, your back is just, it's going to feel cooked during that swim, and you're not going to have as quality of a session as if you had a bit more evenly dispersed of a training week in terms of fatigue, as far as fatigue goes, at least. As far as what exercises you should be doing within your strength training, now goal setting means a lot for all of this stuff, and clearly identifying what you want out of your lifting can go a long way for making sure you get the most out of your lifting. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to assume just general strength and muscle growth is sort of the goal, and nothing more specific than that. Choosing exercises that place your muscles at longer muscle lengths while they're being trained tends to give better results than training a muscle at a shorter muscle length. Now, The idea of long muscle length training has been, I think, a little overblown across social media. It's not the the magic pill that's going to turn you into Arnold, but there is something I think to be said about it. And if we are going to place barriers on how much strength training you can do, which I mean we are, because we are training for a triathlon here. I mean, half a training week is non-strength training related. It matters that we are effective and efficient in the exercises that we select here. So, an easy example, and really one of the hallmark studies that showed this, was where researchers compared a seated leg curl to a lying leg curl, and they matched the volume in terms of the amount of work done between the two exercises. And the group that did the seated leg curls, which again is the same exercise, except in a seated leg curl, your hamstrings are much more stretched than they are in a lying leg curl. The seated leg curl group built much more hamstring muscle. I think it was like 13%. Again, everything will be cited down below, than the lying leg curl group. That same relationship has been shown in the quadriceps, in the biceps. I believe it was failed to be shown in the shoulders when they compared like a cable side raise to a dumbbell side raise, with a cable side raise placing more attention on the stretch part of the rep. But nonetheless, there is a general tendency to say that longer muscle length training, or training muscles under a greater stretch, is somewhat beneficial to making your sets more effective. In line with this, making sure that you're using a full range of motion is the same sort of thing. So, making sure you're not skimping on range of motion, that when you're doing an exercise, like when you're doing a squat, that you're not doing quarter squats, you are squatting all the way down, at least as you are able to with your given body. And then moreover, full range of motion strength training has been shown to be as effective as stretching at improving range of motion and flexibility. If you are training in this way, where you're training muscles at long muscle lengths and you're using a full range of motion, it's unlikely you need to really stack on more stretching and flexibility work on top of that, which just saves you that much more time. Now, as far as volume and intensity goes, again, volume of strength training is measured by the number of sets you take somewhat close to failure per muscle group per week. Intensity is kind of built into the equation there. So you should be getting somewhat near failure in all of your working sets. Warm-up sets aren't really included there. Those are preparation for the real training. So as far as volume goes, or how much of that you should do, the sweet spot is 6 to 10 sets per muscle group per week. The research will tell you that the minimum effective dose, like the least you can do and still see results reliably over time, is 4 sets per muscle group per week. And that tends to just go up with a diminishing rate of return. So, what I mean by that is the more strength training you do, the more results you're likely to see. But going from, let's say, 10 to 12 sets per week for muscle group is going to bring you less results than going from 4 to 6 or 6 to 8, for instance. So when I say 6 to 10 sets per muscle group per week, I'm saying that in terms of my opinion, based on, one of the research, as well as just what I've observed working with people and with myself, is that is going to be the best bang for your buck in terms of the results you'll see, plus the time investment you're going to put into the practice of lifting. Now, with that said, I think it's also typically a good idea to start with the minimum effective dose and slowly increase the volume of that over time until you find your own personal sweet spot. Because as always, there is some nuance person to person. And to me, that's really the most efficient way to find out what the best dose is for you. But it also goes without saying that the lower volume you do, let's say you just don't have time to do a ton of volume, or let's say you are in the later phase of training and you're just prioritizing endurance a bit more than strength training, that makes the benefit of doing something like high stretch training or long muscle length training that much more beneficial. And finally, I just want to touch on some time-saving strategies for strength training, because I think with any hybrid pursuit, really for anything, but especially for hybrid training, being able to get more out of the time you spend doing it is just helpful. It just is. So the two time-saving strategies that I'm going to recommend to you are supersets and drop sets. And again, when I say time-saving strategies, what I mean is that these are training techniques that will give you the same benefit over time for either 1/2 the time investment or 1/3 the time investment, whether you're talking about supersets or drop sets respectively. So a superset is when you go back and forth between two movements that have no overlapping muscles, as opposed to doing straight sets of the same exercise. So an example of that would be doing a set of bench press, resting for 30 seconds to 90 seconds, doing a set of dumbbell rows, and repeating that for however many sets you have planned for the day, as opposed to doing a set of bench press, resting 2 to 4 minutes, doing that for a planned number of sets, and then doing the same thing for dumbbell rows. The reason that's beneficial is because as you are doing the bench press, functionally, the muscles responsible for rowing, they're resting, at least as much as they need to be. And then that decreased rest time, the 30 seconds to 9 minutes, is enough for your sort of cardiovascular system, or that feeling of being winded, to recuperate itself. Whereas if you did, let's say, you're just doing straight sets of bench press, and then you're resting 30 seconds in between sets, you're going to be too fatigued to really pump out a high quality, stimulating set. And you're just not going to see the results that you want to see over time. So that's a superset. That's the first time saving strategy that I recommend to you. The second is a drop set. And something else to say, I have a lot more I have other content where I go much more in detail on these two strategies that I will link down below. I'm just sort of breezing over them for the purpose of not making this video too long, but I will, go more in detail on these and content down below if you want to see that, or if you're interested in making more use of these tactics. Drop sets are where you do an exercise, you take it to near failure, and then you immediately drop the load by about 30%. Now, 30% isn't a hard number. It's what they use in the research, but it is something around there where you can reasonably continue performing reps after performing a set. So an easy example of this would be, let's say you are on a machine chest press that has like a pin weight stack. You do a set with a weight that you can do for about 8 to 12 reps with. Let's say you do 10 or 11 reps. You immediately drop that weight by about 30% and then continue performing reps again until near failure. Functionally, because you stayed at that point of intensity that much longer, one set essentially delivers the benefit of 2 sets for almost the same time investment. Now, also plyometric training, I do have another article where I talk about this in a lot more detail. So if you want to really use this more, I'll link that down below. But again, a plyometric exercise is a power-based movement during which you are bouncing off the ground, for the most part, throughout the exercise. The most common that I personally program are intensive pogos. Now, a pogo jump is where your hips and your knees are, for the most part, straight. I'll link a demo video down below. And you're jumping up and down, pretty much using only your calves and your ankles. And then repeated vertical jumps I also use to incorporate the knee and hips a bit more into the movement, and that's a bit self-explanatory. Now, how to actually program this is, let's say you are following a lower body, upper body training split, and you're about to start a leg day, a lower body strength training day. Before you start your lifts for the day, like let's say you're starting off with a barbell back squat. Before you do your set of barbell back squats, you could do just 2 sets of intensive pogos, let's say, or 2 sets of repeated vertical jumps, whichever one is higher priority for you. And then you begin your strength training day. Again, presuming you have already warmed up, you're not just going straight into these right here, because they should be high velocity, intense. They should, you should be really producing a lot of force to do this right. Doing them at the beginning, one is beneficial because you'll have the energy to actually produce a very high velocity contraction, which is important if you want to get the most out of these. They can serve to sort of prime your body and your legs to feel a bit more powerful as you go into something like a barbell back squat afterward. And then 3, they're just not that fatiguing typically. So if you start to work it off with them, you're not going to be all that tired going into the rest of your training effort. So they're not going to interfere with everything else. They're going to make you feel more powerful. They're going to make you feel springier. And again, you do that 1 to 2 times per week, and you should see a pretty notable benefit in terms of transfer over to running. Now, again, anaerobic conditioning serves to target specific energy systems that most of your endurance training is not going to emphasize quite as much. And it just helps to make sure you have as complete of an engine as possible on race day and just in general. So again, the most important thing here is intensity, and then the duration of exercise is just a function of intensity, because you're going to be using intensities that you just can't sustain for that long. As far as what you select as the exercise, it really depends on if there is a particular part of triathlon that you are notably weaker on. Like if you're a great cyclist but a terrible runner, then you might want running to be the mode of exercise used for this. Or, you could just also use something like an aerodynamic, something full body, if you want to get it as a more broad stimulus, something that's going to apply to both running, cycling, and swimming, or all 3 rather, not both, I should say. So, let's assume you're using full body, a full body training split. You're using that 12-week program with 4-week blocks, and you're at the beginning where it's mostly a strength training sort of focus. You might just add 1 4-minute all-out run at the end of one of your strength training workouts. And again, it's 4 minutes in duration. You're covering as much distance within those 4 minutes as you possibly can. So that should hurt pretty badly. As you get closer to the event itself and you have more time to dedicate toward endurance training type endeavors, you might have an entire session dedicated towards this high intensity type of training. So that could be 2 minutes where you get near that max effort, so 8 out of 10, whatever that means for you. 2 minutes at 4 out of 10, so not a true recovery, but you're going to recover some, and repeat that for, let's say, 5 to 7 rounds. Again, a lot of personalization is good there because it really matters of where you are and what you can handle, what you can recover from. But that's just one example. And again, this is the most painful type of training you should have across the week. It's the most fatiguing. So I very rarely program this more than 1 time per week. The only time I would program anaerobic conditioning more than 1 time per week is if I'm coaching a client or programming for them and they're trying to get better at like a 5K and they're in the peaking phase. Apart from that, I think it's better to just do this 1 time per week and then spend the rest of your time across the week doing other things. So the one exercise I'm going to tell you not to do for this is some type of weight circuit. So something like where you're doing, let's say, squats, deadlifts, jumps, stuff like that. The full range of mechanical tension is just going to stop you long before these specific energy systems stop you. And your goal with this is to target these, isolate these, and be specific to your anaerobic energy system. So airdyne, a constitute row or ski erg, running, cycling, swimming, obviously. Airdyne and rowing can be great if you want a full body stimulus or if you would benefit more from that. Ski erg can be great if you want to do it but don't want to spend just 4 minutes in the pool and then draw out from that. Or, as always, as you get more closer to the event and you want to get more specific, these also make great choices right here. So as we talk about the more triathlon specific training here, again, I'm not going to talk about programming for triathlon or training for triathlon, in general and what the sort of base principles are. I want to keep this specific to what you need to think about if you want to take a hybrid approach to this. And the first thing to really talk about, and what I talked about before, is that bricks are going to be your best friend. Because the amount of days you can spend training towards triathlon are inherently limited by the presence of strength training, then these are really the easiest way to make sure you get all of the modes of triathlon training in across the week. Because again, I like to see each mode of training performed at least twice per week. In my opinion, in my experience, that higher frequency as opposed to one time per week tends to lead to a bit better results than doing just one time per week. And again, triathlon itself is one big brick. When you're running in a triathlon, if you're doing the 5K after a 10-mile bike and the sprint, or if you're doing a marathon after a 112-mile bike and an Ironman, you are going to be running on tired legs. And so getting more specific to that is nothing but to your advantage. And then when it comes to how you structure in terms of intensity and duration, these more true endurance type of trainings, there's really 3 types of trainings I'm going to talk about here. So I'm saying zone 2. I have a lot of other stuff criticizing the use of zone 2. So you've seen that in the content of mine. Substitute this with just low heart rate training, just general aerobic volume accumulation. There is distance focus, where you are pushing the distance that you are pursuing on any given mode of exercise, regardless of the time it takes you to complete it. And then there is speed focus. So you have a fixed distance that you're trying to complete in a faster distance over time, or in a faster time over time. So zone 2, the purpose is to get right below the first lactate threshold and then stay there and then just spend a lot of time there. Now, for most people, it doesn't matter what mode of exercise you're talking about, because running is going to have a higher heart rate correspond to zone 2 than cycling. But for most people, it's going to be somewhere between 50 to 70% of your age predicted max heart rate, which for right now, 220 minus age is fine. There's a lot of problems with this equation, but for right now, it works out well enough. At least I should say that is true for lower distance events. If you're doing an Ironman, you might want to take everything seriously and do everything right. At least consider it. But for most events, that's going to be a fair enough justification. And then you can also define zone 2 as, or this type of training, I should say, as the ability to speak a 10-word sentence without gasping for air. But you would not be able to if you pushed any harder. So right at that border, when you cross that first lactate threshold, that's kind of where sentences and speaking starts to become, or holding conversation in general starts to become notably more difficult. The purpose of doing this type of training is that you can do as much as you want and recover just fine. And then not just that, it is high intensity enough to where it will drive aerobic adaptations. And overall, this type of training really forms, what you call the aerobic base of your endurance training. My personal preference is to, as you are farther away from an event and you're being a bit more general with your programming, is to use more general type of exercises for this type of training. So something like an airdyne or an assault bike would work great. And then as you get closer to the event itself, you're using, let's say running or cycling as your means of accumulating this volume. And again, I have another article explaining this in more detail, which I'll link down below if you're interested in that. So as I said before, the next 2 types of trainings you should have as part of your thought process and part of your toolbox is a speed focus, or a distance focus, and a speed focus. So typically when you're at the beginning phases of a preparatory period for an event, you are spending more of your time doing this distance focus type stuff. And so let's say you're doing an Olympic distance triathlon, like that's the event you signed up for, but you can't run 6 miles straight yet. You just don't have the capacity in your body to handle that volume in one go. And then most certainly not after a 20-mile bike, which is the bike distance in an Olympic mile or Olympic distance triathlon. So the distance focus, where you are increasing the distance you complete week over week, regardless of how much time it takes you to complete it, would be how you start in order to build tolerance to do that. Then once you get to a certain point where you can handle a 6-mile run, or maybe even like a 10-mile run would be more appropriate for this purpose, that's when you start focusing more on speed focus. So you would focus on completing those 6, 8, 10 miles in faster times week over week. And again, you can sort of itemize, what you're progressing in each one of these. So let's say you are, one of your training sessions of the week is a 5-mile bike followed by a 3-mile run. What you could do is keep the run distance the same, but increase the bike distance over time as your means of progressing. Or you could keep the bike distance and the run distance the same, keep the pace on the bike the same, but try to increase the pace and increase or decrease the time to completion of the run week over week if you want to have more of a speed focus. So as far as those low heart rate, just volume accumulation, zone 2 type sessions, 1 to 2 per week is my typical recommendation. And then apart from that, I typically program either 1 or 2 distance focus and 1 speed focus, or vice versa. But typically the distance focused session is going to be a bit easier to tolerate, a bit easier to progress, and leave you feeling a bit less run down and fatigued throughout the week, because the time to complete that distance does not matter so much at that point. And then again, as you transition from farther away from the event to closer to the event, you'll shift away from doing zone 2 and distance focused sessions to more speed focused type sessions. And then, as I've mentioned a lot throughout this video, that really depends on what event it is you're signing up for, and a sprint is going to look vastly different from an Ironman here. So to finish this video off, we're going to talk about tapering, and I'll sort of opine on the recommendations for endurance and for strength training. Now, broadly speaking, the point of a taper is to facilitate maximum recovery from your training and maximum filling of your carbohydrate stores on race day, so you are as prepared for that event as humanly possible. There's a lot of different schools of thought about how to go about this and what best practice is, and I don't know if there is a single best practice for this. I've seen people respond better to some strategies better than others. The two that you'll see the most are by you take your training volume when you finish your last week of training, you cut it by half, and then a few days before the race, you just stop training altogether. You just get light movement in, and that's about it. That's at least as far as training goes right there. I like this one a lot just because it's simple, but again, some people, it is not the best for everyone. The second tactic is to progressively decline volume. And then again, typically there's a couple of days of, 1 to 2 days of no exercise right before, where you're just truly resting. But the length of these tapers are typically 1 to 2 weeks before race day. So if you're doing an Ironman, and I'm using Ironman and sprints a lot in this video just because they are, for the most part, polar opposites, so they sort of paint the picture, the best. You're going to want at least 2 weeks of tapering before going into that, especially because the training for that is going to be much more extensive than for a sprint. And then for a sprint triathlon, 1 week for most people is going to be just fine. The last thing to say in this regard is that maintaining intensity as you decrease volume is typically good practice. And then as you get closer to that end point of the taper, you can also decrease intensity just to make sure you are feeling your best going in. And then again, the other key thing about tapering is to make sure your carbohydrate stores, which are mostly stored within your muscle and your liver, are as filled with carbohydrates as humanly possible on race day. So the typical recommendation you'll see is throughout this taper somewhere between 6 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body mass. And 12 is a lot. And for most people, pretty uncomfortable to actually put in, even if you really like carbohydrates. I promise you that's the case. Typically what I recommend is start off the first week at 6 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram body mass. Again, the longer distance you're doing of a race, the more carbohydrates you're going to need, and then increase your amount over time until you get to the race day. And then, a couple of days before race day, just make sure you're eating a high dose of carbohydrates, but, in a way that just makes you feel good, and you're not experimenting with new foods to, risk any sort of gastrointestinal distress, things like that. With that said, I'm going to end this video right here. I hope that was somewhat helpful, interesting, or somewhere between. If you have any questions, comments, concerns about anything I said, don't hesitate to comment down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Hope you have a great day, and I will speak to you soon.